I heard a commotion far out at sea. It was 3 ships going by, and they were filled with people. They must have been celebrating something, for the ships would blow their horns, and the people would cheer in response. After they passed out of view, I turned back to look at my mother, but I could not see her. My eyes searched the small area of water where she had been, where she should have been, but I couldn't find her. I stood up and started to call out her name, but no sound would come out of my throat. A huge black space opened up in front of me, and I fell inside it. I couldn't see what was in front of me, and I couldn't hear anything around me. I couldn't think of anything except that my mother was no longer near me. Things went on this way for I don't know how long. I don't know what, but something drew my eye in one direction. A little bit out of the area in which she usually swam was my mother, just sitting and tracing patterns on a large rock. She wasn't paying any attention to me, for she didn't know that I had missed her. I was glad to see her and started jumping up and down and waving to her. Still, she didn't see me, and then I started to cry, for it dawned on me that, with all that water between us, and I being unable to swim, my mother could stay there forever, and the only way I would be able to wrap my arms around her again was if it pleased her or if I took a boat. I cried until I wore myself out. My tears ran down into my mouth, and it was the first time that I realized tears had a bitter and salty taste. Finally, my mother came ashore. She was, of course, alarmed when she saw my face, for I had let the tears just dry there and they left a stain. When I told her what had happened, she hugged me so close that it was hard to breathe, and she told me that nothing could be further from the truth, that she would never, ever leave me. And though she said it over and over again, and though I felt better, I could not wipe out of my mind the feeling I had had when I couldn't find her. The summer just passed. I kept having a dream about my mother sitting on the rock. Over and over I would have the dream. Only in it my mother never came back, and sometimes my father would join her. When he joined her, they would both sit tracing patterns on the rock, and it must have been amusing for them. They would always make each other laugh. At first, I didn't say anything, but when I began to have the dream again and again, I finally told my mother. My mother became instantly distressed. Tears came to her eyes, and taking me in her arms, she told me all the same things she had told me on the day at sea. And this time, the memory of the dark time, when I felt I would never see her again, did not come back to haunt me. I didn't exactly tell a lie about the last part. That is just what would have happened in the old days. But actually, the past year saw me launched into young ladiness. And when I told my mother of my dream, my nightmare really, I was greeted with a turned back and a warning against eating certain kinds of fruit in an unripe state just before going to bed. I placed the old days version before my classmates because I thought I couldn't bear to show my mother in a bad light before people who hardly knew her. But the real truth was that I couldn't bear to have anyone see how deep in disfavor I was with my mother. As we walked back to the classroom, I in the air, my classmates on the ground, jostling each other to say some words of appreciation and congratulation to me, my head felt funny, as if it had swelled up to the size of and weighed no more than a blown-up balloon. Often I had been told by my mother not to feel proud of anything I had done, and in the next breath that I couldn't feel enough pride about something I had done. Now I tossed from one to the other, my head bowed down to the ground, my head high up in the air. I looked at these girls surrounding me, my heart filled with just sprung up love, and I wished then and there to spend the rest of my life only with them. As we approached our classroom, I felt a pinch on my arm. It was an affectionate pinch, I could tell. It was the girl who had earlier that day asked me if my name was Annie John. Now she told me that her name was Gwyneth Joseph, and reaching into the pocket of her tunic, she brought out a small rock and presented it to me. She had found it, she said, at the foot of a sleeping volcano. The rock was black, and it felt rough in my hands, as if it had been through a lot. I immediately put it to my nose to see what it smelled like. It smelled of lavender because Gwyneth Joseph had kept it wrapped in a handkerchief doused in that scent. It may have been in that moment that we fell in love. Later, we could never agree on when it was. That afternoon, we walked home together, she going a little out of her usual way, and we exchanged likes and dislikes, our jaws dropping and eyes widening when we saw how similar they were. We separated ourselves from the other girls, and they, understanding everything, left us alone. We cut through a tamarind grove, we cut through a cherry tree grove. We passed down the lane where all the houses had elaborate hedges growing in front so that nothing was visible but the upstairs windows. When we came to my street, parting was all but unbearable. Tomorrow, we said to cheer each other up. Gwen and I were soon inseparable. If you saw one, you saw the other. For me, each day began as I waited for Gwen to come by and fetch me for school. My heart beat fast as I stood in the front yard of our house waiting to see Gwen as she rounded the bend in our street. The sun, already way up in the sky so early in the morning, shone on her, and the whole street became suddenly empty, so that Gwen and everything about her were perfect, as if she were in a picture. Her Panama hat and the navy blue and gold satin ribbon, our school colors around the brim, sat lopsided on her head. For her head was small, and she never seemed to get the correct size hat, and it had to be anchored with a piece of elastic running under her chin. The pleats in the tunic of her uniform were in place, as was to be expected. Her cotton socks fit nearly around her ankles, and her shoes shone from just being polished. If a small breeze blew, it would ruffle the ribbons in her short, shrubby hair and the hem of her tunic. If the hem of her tunic was disturbed in that way, I would then be able to see her knees. She had bony knees, and they were always ash-colored, as if she had just finished giving them a good scratch or had just finished saying her prayers. The breeze might also blow back the brim of her hat, and since she always walked with her head held down, I might then be able to see her face. A small, flattish nose, lips the shape of a saucer broken evenly in two, wide, high cheekbones, ears pinned back close against her head, which was always set in a serious way, as if she were going over in her mind some of the many things we had hit upon that were truly a mystery to us. Though once I told her that about her face, and she said that really she had only been thinking about me. I didn't look to make sure, but I felt as if my whole skin had become covered with millions of tiny red boils, and that shortly I would explode with happiness. When finally she reached me, she would look up, and we would both smile and say softly, "Hi." We'd set off for school side by side, our feet in step, not touching but feeling as if we were joined at the shoulder, hip, and ankle, not to mention heart. As we walked together, we told each other things we had judged most private and secret, things we had overheard our parents say, dreams we had had the night before, the things we were really afraid of, but especially we told of our love for each other. Except for the ordinary things that naturally came up, I never told her about my changed feeling for my mother. I could see in that what high regard Gwen held for me, and I couldn't bear for her to see the great thing I had had once and then lost without an explanation. By the time we got to school, our chums often seemed overbearing, with their little comments on the well-pressedness of each other's uniforms, or on the neatness of their schoolbooks, or on how much they approved of the way Miss Nelson was wearing her hair these days. A few other girls were having much the same experience as Gwen and I, and when we heard comments of this kind, we would look at each other and roll up our eyes and toss our hands in the air, a way of saying how above such concerns we were. The gesture was an exact copy, of course, of what we had seen our mothers do. My life in school became just the opposite of my first morning. I went from being ignored with hardly a glance from anyone to having girls vie for my friendship, or at least for more than just a passing acquaintanceship. Both my classmates and my teachers noticed how quick I was at learning things. I was soon given responsibility for overseeing the class in the teacher's absence. At first, I was a little taken aback by this, but then I got used to it. I indulged many things, especially if they would end in a laugh or something touching. I would never dilly-dally with a decision, always making up my mind right away about the things in front of me. Sometimes, seeing my old, frail self in a girl, I would defend her. Sometimes, seeing my old, frail self in a girl, I would be heartless and cruel. It all went over quite well, and I became very popular. My so recently much hated body was now a plus. I excelled at games and was named a captain of a volleyball team. As I was favored by my classmates inside and outside the classroom, so was I favored by my teachers, though only inside the classroom, for I had become notorious to them for doing forbidden things. If sometimes I stood away from myself and took a look at who I had become, I couldn't be more surprised at what I saw. But since who I had become earned me the love and devotion of Gwen and the other girls, I was only egged on to find new and better ways to entertain them. I don't know what invisible standard was set, or by whom or exactly when, but 8 of us met it, and soon to the other girls we were something to comment on favorably or unfavorably, as the case might be. It was in a nook of some old tombstones, a place discovered by girls going to our school long before we were born, shaded by trees with trunks so thick it would take 4 arms' lengths to encircle them, that we would sit and talk about the things we were on our minds that day. On our minds every day were our breasts and their refusal to budge out of our chests. On hearing somewhere that if a boy rubbed your breasts, they would quickly swell up, I passed along this news, since in the world we occupied and hoped forever to occupy, boys were banished. We had to make do with ourselves. What perfection we found in each other, sitting on those tombstones of long dead people who had been the masters of our ancestors. Nothing in particular really troubled us except for the annoyance of a fly colliding with our lips, sticky from eating fruits, a bee wanting to nestle in our hair, the breeze suddenly blowing too strong. We were sure that the much talked about future that everybody was preparing us for would never come, for we had such a powerful feeling against it, and why shouldn't our will prevail this time? Sometimes, when we looked to each other, it was all we could do not to cry out with happiness. My own special happiness was, of course, with Gwen. She would stand in front of me trying to see into my murky black eyes, a way she said to tell exactly what I was thinking. After a short while, she would give up at saying, "I can't make out a thing," only my same old face. I would then laugh at her and kiss her on the neck, sending her into a fit of shivers, as if someone had exposed her to a cold draft when she had a fever. Sometimes, when she spoke to me, so overcome with feeling, would I be that I was no longer able to hear what she said, I could only make out her mouth as it moved up and down. I told her that I wished I had been named Enid, after Enid Blyton, the author of the first books I had discovered on my own and liked. I told her that when I was younger, I had been afraid of my mother's dying, but that since I had met Gwen, this didn't matter so much. Whenever I spoke of my mother to her, I was always sure to turn the corners of my mouth down to show my scorn. I said that I could not wait for us to grow up so we could live in a house on our own. I had already picked out the house. It was a gray one with many rooms, and it was in the lane where all the houses had high, well-trimmed hedges. With all my plans, she agreed, and I'm sure that if she had had any plans of her own, I would have agreed with them also. On the morning of the first day I started to menstruate, I felt strange in a new way, hot and cold at the same time, with horrible pains running up and down my legs. My mother, knowing what was the matter, brushed aside my complaints and said that it was all to be expected and I would soon get used to everything. Seeing my gloomy face, she told me in a half-joking way all about her own experience with the first step in coming of age, as she called it, which had happened when she was as old as I was. I pretended that this information made us close as in the old days, but to myself I said, "What a serpent." I walked to school with Gwen, feeling as I supposed a dog must feel when it has done something wrong and is ashamed of itself and trying to get somewhere quick where it can lie low. The cloth between my legs grew heavier and heavier with every step I took, and I was sure that everything about me broadcast, "She's menstruating today, she's menstruating today." When Gwen heard what had happened, tears came to her eyes. She had not yet had the wonderful experience, and I could see that she cried for herself. She said that in sympathy she would wear a cloth too. In class, for the first time in my life, I fainted. Miss Nelson had to revive me, passing her smelling salts, which she had in a beautiful green vial, back and forth under my nose. She then took me to nurse, who said that it was the fright of all the unexpected pain that had caused me to faint. But I knew that I had fainted after I brought to my mind a clear picture of myself sitting at my desk in my own blood. At recess, among the tombstones, I of course had to exhibit and demonstrate. None of the others were menstruating yet. I showed everything without the least bit of flourish, since my heart wasn't in it. I wished instead that one of the other girls were in my place and that I was just sitting there in amazement. How nice they all were, though, rallying to my side, offering shoulders on which to lean, laps in which to rest my weary, aching head, and kisses that really did soothe. When I looked at them sitting around me, the church in the distance, beyond that, our school, with throngs of girls crossing back and forth in the schoolyard, beyond that, the world, how I wished that everything would fall away so that suddenly we'd be sitting in some different atmosphere with no future full of ridiculous demands, no need for any sustenance save our love for each other, with no hindrance of any of our desires, which would, of course, be simple desires. Nothing, just sitting on our tombstones forever. But that could never be, as the tolling of the school bell testified. We walked back to class slowly, as if going to a funeral. Gwen and I vowed to love each other always, but the words had a hollow ring, and when we looked at each other, we couldn't sustain the gaze. It had been decided by Miss Nelson and Nurse that I was not to return to school after lunch, with Nurse sending instructions to my mother to keep me in bed for the rest of the day. When I got home, my mother came toward me, arms outstretched, concern written on her face, my whole mouth filled up with a bitter taste, for I could not understand how she could be so beautiful, even though I no longer loved her.